I didn't cry when the lawyer skipped my name. I just stared at the coffee mug in my hands. Cool to the touch, untouched. The smell of old varnish clung to my father's study. Same bookshelf, same dusty lamp, same worn rug under my chair, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. To my daughter, Ivy Hayes. Mr. Glass read, eyes darting past me. She nodded softly, squeezing our mother's hand. Her polished nails gleamed. Her smile didn't falter. The will continued. Furniture, bank accounts, the family home. All of it went to Ivy. Not one mention of me. I glanced at Mom. She blinked slowly, expression blank. The stroke had taken her words years ago, but I could still feel her silence pressing against me like a second betrayal. 15 years. I stayed. I cooked, cleaned, handled appointments, paid bills when Dad lost track. I watched Ivy fly in for Thanksgiving with gifts and gold earrings and left with praise I never received. And now I was invisible. Is this final? I managed to ask. Glass looked up. It was signed in 2022. Filed officially. Then, quieter. Any prior drafts would have been destroyed by now. Ivy didn't even look at me. She adjusted the shawl on our mother's shoulders. Then she reached for the folder and tucked it neatly into her handbag. I sat there, still holding that mug. Chamomile tea. He always brewed it when he had something hard to say. The bitter taste lingered, though I never brought it to my lips. They erased me. From paper, from memory, from the home I never stopped protecting. And yet, I felt something shift. Not rage, not grief. A cold, anchored clarity. If they thought they'd buried the truth, they forgot I was the one who kept everything. Every file. Every receipt. Every backup. They burned the paper. But they didn't check the drive. Would you fight back, or just walk away quietly? Where are you listening from? Has anyone ever cut you out like this? I used to wake up at 5040 every morning. The hallway light would flicker once as I passed the linen closet. Coffee. One slice of toast. Then the slow creak of the wooden stairs as I checked on Mom. Her room always smelled like lavender lotion and lemon disinfectant. By then, she was already awake. Eyes open. Still, I'd adjust her pillows, play the same old jazz CD Dad once made for her. Billie Holiday, track 3 always skipped. And pour her a glass of water. That was my rhythm for 15 years. I gave up a teaching opportunity in Pittsburgh when Mom had the stroke. Dad never asked me to stay, but he didn't have to. It's only temporary, I told myself. She needs me now. I'll go later. Later turned into over a decade. Ivy called once a month. Maybe. When she visited, it was with designer scarves and candles from upscale stores in Boston. Dad would beam. You know how busy your sister is. He'd say, his tone softening whenever her name came up. He never said thank you. But I didn't expect it. At least, not until the will. The night after the reading, I sat alone at my kitchen table. The light above me flickered. Always did that when the heater kicked on. My phone buzzed. A message from Ivy. Hope you're okay. Let's just trust Dad knew what was best. I stared at the screen. Then I turned it face down. The chair across from me was empty. Same chair I used to help Mom into on Sunday mornings. Same table where I'd print medication schedules and grocery lists. Now, just me and an unpaid heating bill on the corner. I closed my eyes. Breathed in. I needed answers. 2 days later, I went back to the house. Ivy wasn't there. The key still worked. Dust had already settled on the hall table. Mail stacked, unopened. I walked into Dad's study, the one with the green leather chair he refused to replace. Everything smelled the same. Mahogany. Old paper. A hint of pipe smoke, even years after he quit. The bookshelf still leaned slightly to the right. I opened the bottom drawer. Nothing. The second drawer held his planner from 2022. Appointments scribbled, mostly illegible. But when I slid the top drawer open, something caught. A thin folder wedged behind the drawer track. I reached in and tugged it free. Inside, a folded document, yellowed edges, torn in one corner. The heading read Durable Power of Attorney, 2015. My name was listed. Not Ivy's. I blinked, heart thudding. This wasn't a will, but it meant something. At the bottom, a faint signature. My father's, unmistakable. The notary's seal was smudged, but present. The date matched what I remembered. The year I'd taken Mom in full time. The year Dad started saying, "When the time comes, this house is yours." I heard the front door click. Footsteps. Ivy. She froze when she saw the paper in my hands. "What is that?" she asked. Her tone was flat, cold. "Something he didn't burn," I said. She crossed the room quickly, hand outstretched. "He updated everything. That's outdated. Don't start digging things up." "Is that what you did in the kitchen last week?" I asked. "The old documents. The shredder smell." She paused, lips tightening. "It was clutter. That's all." I slid the paper back into the folder. "You should go," she said. "I'm handling the transfer. You don't need to be here anymore." I left without another word, but I didn't go home. I drove to the library, logged into one of the old desktop computers in the back, pulled up my email, and that's when I remembered the computer in Dad's office. The one he kept turned off. Even after he got a tablet, it had always sat under the desk, covered in dust. Never moved. Never unplugged. I'd never checked it. Never needed to. But now, I wasn't looking for memories. I was looking for proof. Back at the house, after Ivy had gone, I sat down at the desk. Pressed the power button. It groaned to life. The screen blinked twice before settling on a login. He had never set a password. Folders lined the desktop, most of them labeled by year. One folder sat alone in the corner. While I'll at best keep Shar OTA 2015, I opened it. Inside a scanned PDF, my name, the property address, the signature, clear sharp. Metadata confirmed created in 2015. Last opened in 2016. I clicked, Properties. Uploaded from a USB drive. I turned to the back of the monitor, and there it was. Still plugged in. Covered in dust. Forgotten. Just like me. I didn't sleep that night. The scan of the will glowed in my mind like a silent alarm. Every line, every signature, burned behind my eyelids. I printed 3 copies from the library printer at 6:45 a.m., the paper still warm in my hands when I tucked them into a plain manila folder. I labeled it in pencil 2015, Will Backup. No drama, no labels screaming revenge, just fact. At school, I moved through the halls like a ghost. My students noticed. "Everything okay, Ms. Hayes?" one of them asked as I passed by the lockers. I forced a smile. Just a long week. I couldn't tell them the truth. That my name had been erased from the only place that still felt like mine. That my family, the people I'd sacrificed my life for, had rewritten me into nothing. After last period, I drove straight to the county records office. The building was squat, red brick, with flickering fluorescent lights and the faint smell of old carpet. The woman at the front desk wore thick glasses and a cardigan dotted with cat pins. "Hi," I said, voice steady. "I need to check if this document is on file." I slid the printed will across the counter. She studied the paper, then tapped her keyboard, her brows furrowed. "This name isn't in our archive," she said. "Only the 2022 version was registered and recorded. That's the one with Ivy Hayes listed as sole heir." I nodded. "And if this version had existed, but never filed, would that make it invalid?" She hesitated. "Technically, yes. But if you can prove the signature's authentic, and that it predates the current will, it could open an inquiry." She lowered her voice. "You'd need a legal motion. Probably more than just this." I thanked her and walked out into the cold March air. Wind slipped down my collar, sharp and indifferent. I wasn't ready for court, but I wasn't backing down either. That evening I called Susan Albright. We hadn't spoken in years. Not since high school reunions stopped feeling friendly and started feeling like performance reviews. She picked up after 2 rings. "Charlotte," she said, voice surprised. "It's been forever." "I found something," I said, "and I think I need your help." I told her everything. The will, the forgotten USB, the signature, the metadata. Susan stayed quiet until I finished. Then she said, "Bring it in. I'll take a look." Her office was tucked inside the Monroe County Courthouse Annex. Upstairs, past a mural of founding fathers and a faded poster warning about identity fraud. She wore the same neat ponytail I remembered from debate club, but her eyes were sharper now. She flipped through the copies, scanned the digital file on her desktop, checked the timestamp properties. Then she leaned back in her chair. "It's real," she said. I felt my hands go still in my lap. "You have a solid argument," she continued. "But Ivy's got the paper trail. 2022's version is clean, notarized, filed on time." She looked at me. "You'd need to prove manipulation, or at least negligence. Anything that casts doubt." "I found a torn-up power of attorney in Dad's study," I said. She raised a brow. "Do you still have it?" I nodded. "Then you have something Ivy forgot to destroy." "That's leverage." Back at the house that weekend, I waited for Ivy to leave. She came on Saturdays now, checking mail, pacing the property like she already owned it. She stayed for 22 minutes. Long enough to take a call on speaker near the porch. Her voice floated through the open window. "Yes. The deed will be finalized by next month. She's not contesting anything." "No worries." I stood in the back room silent. The word deed crawled down my spine. She was selling it. That's why the rush. That's why the timing. And they thought I'd just vanish. I waited until she pulled out of the driveway. Then I slipped inside. I didn't have much time. The house felt colder than usual. The kind of cold that sinks into old wood, into old walls, into old wounds. Dad's computer still sat where I'd left it. I checked the USB again, still intact. I copied everything to my own drive, scanned for hidden folders and encrypted duplicates. Then I opened the browser history. That's when I saw it. A link bookmarked, Raven Holdings LLC. Transfer, Forms, Raven Holdings. It didn't sound like a law firm. More like a shell company. I clicked. The page was gone, but the URL remained. And that was enough to raise a flag. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The hum of the fridge in my apartment buzzed like a warning. I thought about Ivy's earrings. Her confident voice on the porch. The way she smiled at Mom like nothing had ever been taken. I thought about how many times I'd pushed back my own life to keep that house running. The paint I reapplied every summer. The kitchen tile I patched myself with a YouTube tutorial. The way I sat beside Mom every night, even when she no longer recognized me. And now, Ivy was transferring everything through a name I didn't recognize. Selling it. Erasing me. I made one more call. This time, to a friend of Susan's. A man named Daniel who worked in property record audits. He called back the next morning. "There's a pending request for sale," he said. "Filed 2 weeks ago. Initiated by Ivy Hayes. Acting as sole property owner." I felt my stomach clench. "They're laundering it," I said. "Or at least hiding it. I need to stop that sale." Daniel was quiet for a beat. "Then you'll need to go to court," he said. And fast. I didn't go to school that Monday. I called in sick, though nothing about me felt sick. Just sharp, too sharp, like I'd been holding a blade in my chest for too long, and now it was slicing its way out. Instead, I drove to the courthouse. The sky was slate gray, the kind of color that settles into your ribs. Rain threatened, but never fell. Susan met me by the security checkpoint. Her heels clicked against the tile like she meant every step. "You're sure?" she asked as we climbed the stairs. "I am," I said, "but I need it to be quiet. No press? No family warning?" She nodded. "You'll file a motion for injunction first. It'll freeze any title transfers temporarily. Then we'll open review. And Ivy. She won't know until she's served." The filing office smelled like dry ink and faint mildew. The clerk barely glanced at me. Just scanned the folder, typed something, stamped the motion. When she handed it back, my hands trembled. Not fear. Release? I had taken the first step. I went back to the house one more time. This time not to search, but to see. To look at the place I had poured myself into for 15 years. The white shutters I had repainted 3 summers ago. The porch swing I sanded and stained every fall. The garden, though choked with weeds, still cradled the outline of Mom's favorite rosebushes. Inside, I walked past the piano with its one missing key. The hallway mirror that always tilted left. And into Dad's study. I stood in the doorway, and that's when I saw it. A file folder on the desk. It hadn't been there before. Ivy must have come back. I opened it slowly. Inside, closing documents. Signed, stamped. The buyer listed as Raven Holdings LLC Bow. Closing date 3 weeks from today. The number at the bottom chilled me. It was half the property's worth. They were selling fast. Fast enough to keep it off the radar. Fast enough to erase me before I could speak. I made another copy. Photographed every page. Backed up every image to the cloud, to the USB, to my external drive. And I called Daniel. He whistled low. "She's transferring under a shell corp," he said. "That's deliberate. Someone's hiding money." I felt my breath steady. She picked the wrong sister to erase. The next morning, Ivy showed up at my apartment. I was in the kitchen, making tea, when I heard the knock. I opened the door, and there she was. Leather boots, slick ponytail, eyes like polished glass. She didn't wait for an invitation. Just walked in. "You filed something?" she said. Not a question. A statement. I didn't answer. "You're making a mistake, Charlotte. You don't know what you're stepping into." I crossed my arms, then enlightened me. She laughed. The sound was brittle. "This house? It's not just Dad's estate. There's a lot tied to it. You don't want to be dragged into this." My fingers clenched the edge of the counter. Dragged into what, Ivy? I lived there. I scrubbed Mom's sheets, paid half the heating bills when Dad lost track of the mortgage. What exactly am I not supposed to be part of? She hesitated. "You always make everything about duty, about what you gave up. But Dad chose me. He didn't." Her jaw twitched. "He did when he signed the 2022 version. After you burned the one from 2015. Her mouth opened. Closed. No denial. I stepped closer. "There's a copy. There's metadata. There's a timestamp from the original scan, Ivy. You didn't erase it. You just buried it." For the first time, her eyes faltered. "You're bluffing," she said quietly. "Then take me to court," I said. She left without another word. But I knew what would happen next. They'd push harder. Call in lawyers. Maybe leak things. Stories about me being unstable, isolated, ungrateful. I wasn't afraid. I'd spent years invisible. Being seen, even as a threat, was a strange kind of freedom. That night, I opened my laptop. Opened a blank document. Typed a single line. Timeline of events. Charlotte Hayes. I documented everything. Phone records. Emails. Photos. Bank transfers. Mom's prescriptions I picked up. Receipts for the new roof I paid for in 2019. Every contribution they thought would fade with memory. I wrote it all down. Dated. Backed up. Printed. The next day Susan called. "We've got a court date," she said. 2 weeks from Friday. They'll try to dismiss it, but once we submit the metadata and closing docs, we'll hold the line. I took a breath. I'll be ready. And I was. Not just for court. For the silence to finally end. For the story to stop being something whispered between family and lawyers. And to start being something spoken. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal. It was realizing that no one, not Ivy, not even my mother, was going to stop it. That night, I visited Mom at the care center. She was in her usual chair by the window, a soft blanket over her legs, eyes watching nothing. I brought her favorite warm apple juice with a cinnamon stick. She didn't react. The nurse said she'd been quieter lately. Less eye contact, fewer responses. I sat down beside her, held her hand. It felt small, smaller than I remembered. "Did you know?" I whispered. "Did you agree with what they did?" No answer. Just the faint wheeze of the oxygen machine in the corner. A framed photo sat on the shelf behind her. The three of us, Dad, Ivy, and me. Taken 20 years ago in front of the house. I wasn't smiling in the picture. I remembered that day. Mom had forgotten my birthday the day before. And Dad made us take that photo like nothing had happened. I walked out of the room, heart heavy, breath tight. The hall smelled like bleach and something sweet, industrial strawberry air freshener. My phone buzzed. A new email. Subject: Property Transfer Inquiry URGENT from Raven Holdings LLC Gmail. I opened it. Charlotte Hayes, please be advised. Any continued interference in this matter may constitute harassment. Our legal team is monitoring your activity. You are not authorized to access or distribute materials related to the 2022 will. No signature. No name, just that email address. They were watching. Already reaching into my inbox, trying to rattle me. At home, I closed the curtains. I turned off the Wi-Fi. Disconnected the USB, moved all backup files to a separate hard drive I stored in a fireproof box under the sink. Then I sat at the kitchen table. The hum of the fridge filled the silence. I stared at the wall for a long time. They didn't just want the house. They wanted the story to disappear, to be the only ones left standing, with no trace of what I'd done, of who I was. The next day, I walked into school like nothing had happened. But it followed me. In the classroom, I forgot a student's name I'd known for months. In the hallway, I walked past a coworker without saying hello. At lunch, Mrs. Klein sat beside me. She tapped her thermos gently. "You seem off," she said. I smiled faintly. "Family stuff." She gave a knowing nod, then said quietly, "Funny how family can make you feel more alone than anyone else ever could." That night, I found myself rereading old emails from Dad. Most were reminders, utility bills, appointments, grocery lists. But one stood out. Sent June 3, 2015. Subject: Just in case. Charlotte. This is the scanned version. You keep one. I'll keep one. I know this isn't how we wanted things to go, but you've earned this house more than anyone. I love you. Dad. It was there, the proof that he meant for me to have it. His words, not just legal jargon. And somehow, it hurt worse than anything Ivy had done. Because it meant that at some point, he had stood on my side. And still, in the end, he let her win. I printed the email, slid it into the growing folder I carried with me everywhere now. Like armor, like memory. The following weekend, I passed by the house again. There was a car in the driveway. Not Ivy's. A man I didn't recognize. He stood on the porch, clipboard in hand, measuring dimensions. He didn't knock. Didn't go inside. Just circled the property with slow, practiced steps. An inspector, maybe a contractor. I parked down the block and waited. After 20 minutes, he left. Got into his truck. Drove away. I walked back toward the house. On the front gate, a folded slip of paper was tucked beneath the mailbox. I unfolded it. Final walkthrough, Schedule A, April 18, 10:00 a.m. 2 weeks. That's all I had left. Unless I stopped it. Unless I made them listen. I watched the inspector drive off, then stood at the gate longer than I meant to. The paper in my hand fluttered slightly in the breeze. April 18th, 10 a.m., final walkthrough. That meant the sale was happening. Ivy wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't invisible to her. I was an obstacle now. I called Susan that same afternoon. Her tone had changed since our last call. Tighter, more alert. "They've moved up the transfer," I said. "There's a walkthrough scheduled, less than 2 weeks." "Then we move now," she replied. "You have the metadata, the email, the prior document. We file the injunction and petition for a temporary freeze." "I'm ready." "You're sure?" She paused. "They're going to push back harder. You're not just challenging a will anymore. You're accusing them of manipulation." "I'm not accusing," I said. "I'm proving." That night, I made copies of everything. 2 full printed sets. One for Susan. One for the court. I laid each page flat on the living room floor. My name, the 2015 signature, the power of attorney, the email from Dad, the file metadata showing the scan. I'd never felt so calm. So certain. Justice didn't feel loud. It felt precise. Cold, even. By Thursday, the petition was filed. Susan sent me a photo of the stamped confirmation. Motion for temporary injunction on title transfer, Monroe County. It was real now. Not just in folders or old drives. Now it had a docket number. Now it had a date. Ivy called that evening. I didn't pick up. She didn't leave a voicemail. But a few minutes later, an email came in. Subject: really? I hope you know what you're doing. You're going to drag Mom into this. You're going to embarrass Dad's name. For what? A house. I didn't reply. Because it was never just a house. It was what the house represented. Everything they thought I was too quiet to protect. Too polite to fight for. On Saturday morning, Susan and I met with the county judge. It was a small office, tucked behind the larger courtroom. No cameras, no audience. Just oak furniture, quiet voices, and 3 copies of Truth. The judge listened. He read the petition, then flipped through the documents. He paused on the scanned will. On Dad's signature. On the metadata log. On the power of attorney, the date matching the email. "This document predates the one on file," he said. "Was it ever formally revoked?" Susan answered, "No, Your Honor, and the petitioner has reason to believe the newer version was filed without disclosure of prior documentation." He looked at me. "You're Charlotte Hayes?" "Yes, sir. You were the primary caregiver. For 15 years. He nodded slowly. Then signed the order. Motion granted. All transactions, transfers, or listings involving the property at 43 Elkhart Avenue are hereby frozen pending further investigation. By the time I stepped outside the courthouse, my knees nearly gave out. Not from fear. From something quieter. Relief with weight. Susan walked beside me in silence. She didn't smile. Neither did I. We just breathed. I didn't tell Ivy. Let the courier do that. Instead, I sat in my kitchen with a mug of tea. Chamomile, just like Dad used to make, and watched the spring rain start against the window. 3 days later, Ivy showed up at my apartment again. No warning. I opened the door. She didn't wait. "You froze the sale," she said. Voice clipped. Hair pulled back tighter than ever. "I did. You have no idea what you're ruining." "No," I said. "I know exactly what I'm stopping." She walked past me, pacing. "You think this is about fairness? About what you deserve? Dad made a choice." I didn't answer. I just laid the printed email on the table. The one he wrote me. She stared at it. Didn't touch it. You always had to be the martyr. She muttered. And you always had to win. I replied. We stood there, silence stretching thin. Then she left. No slamming door. No final threat. Just quiet footsteps down the hall. That night, Susan forwarded a copy of the court schedule. Our preliminary hearing was set. 2 weeks. It would be private. But real. No more silencing. No more pretending. I spent the next few days organizing everything again. Printing clean copies. Backing up drives. Practicing what I'd say. Not with drama. Not with anger. Just the truth. Mom didn't respond when I visited. But I held her hand anyway. Told her what was happening. Told her I hoped she would understand. Her fingers twitched once. Or maybe I imagined it. I kissed her forehead gently before leaving. The air in the room smelled like lemon cleaner and the softest kind of sadness. Outside, the sun had broken through the gray. Just barely, and I thought to myself, let them come. Let them bring their lawyers, their polished lies, their folders full of edited facts. Because this time, I had my own truth, and I wasn't giving it up. Would you let family rewrite your story, or fight to reclaim your name? If you've ever had to stand alone to protect what was yours, I'd love to hear your story. You're not alone. I knew exactly what I needed to do. No more waiting. No more reacting. If I wanted them to take this seriously, I had to come prepared. More than just stories and scanned papers. I needed a timeline. A chain of evidence. And people who could help me build it right. I emailed Kayla that night. We hadn't spoken since grad school. She worked in information security now, mostly for nonprofits, sometimes on contract for the state. She wrote back within 10 minutes. I'm in. Forward everything. Be safe. I uploaded a ZIP folder. Metadata logs, scanned wills, screenshots of emails from Dad, copies of Ivy's sale documents, and a snapshot of the closing paperwork with Raven Holdings LLC. Within an hour, she sent back a cleaned-up metadata breakdown. Your 2015 doc. Untouched. No edit trail. Signed on a machine tied to your father's IP. Timestamp June 3, 2015, 10:12 p.m. Filed to his desktop drive and USB simultaneously. That holds up in court. She paused. The 2022 version. There's a weird gap. No metadata. Looks like a scanned hard copy with missing source info. If someone wanted to hide the chain, this is what they'd submit. Next, I called Daniel. He worked in property title verification. Got a name for you, he said, voice low. Raven Holdings is tied to 3 other shell entities, all out of Nevada. And guess whose name showed up as a part-time logistics contractor for one of them? I waited. Brian Keene. Ivy's fiancé, the man she kept out of sight but always mentioned as working behind the scenes. Daniel continued. Keene filed incorporation for one of the entities last fall. 3 months before your dad passed. I closed my eyes. Of course. This wasn't just favoritism. It was orchestration. I met Susan at her office the next morning. She had already printed and filed the judge's freeze order. She looked up from her desk as I laid down the new documents. I'm building a timeline, I said. Every lie. Every transaction. I want them to feel it stack. She nodded. Good, because this is no longer a family dispute. This is asset manipulation. Possibly fraud. I told her about Raven Holdings. The connection to Brian. The metadata gaps in the 2022 will. She looked up sharply. If we prove that will was fabricated. Or at least altered. This case flips. I spent the next 2 days building the presentation. Each piece labeled, numbered. Email from Dad, PDF metadata, USB confirmation, login timestamps, power of attorney, comparison of 2015 vs. 2022 signatures, transfer docs signed by Ivy, Shell Company Registry, Brian's logistics filing. By the end, the file binder was nearly 2 inches thick, and every page pointed in one direction. They tried to make me disappear. But they left fingerprints on everything. I sent one final message to Kayla. Can you track the IP that submitted the 2022 version? She replied the next morning. Submission originated from a device tied to an IVH work email. Network address matches a Boston co-working space. Timestamp 2013 AM, 3 days before filing. You want a screenshot? Yes. I wanted every screenshot. I printed them all. The morning of the hearing, I wore my navy blue blazer. Not the one from the school assemblies. The one I'd saved for something important. Pressed slacks. Flats polished. I pulled my hair back. Not tight, not theatrical. Just enough. As I stepped into the courthouse, I passed Ivy in the hallway. She was flanked by 2 attorneys. Brian trailed behind them in a gray suit that didn't quite fit. He avoided my eyes. Ivy didn't. She stared straight at me. No smile, no fear, just control, or the illusion of it. Susan and I walked quietly to the conference room. The judge hadn't arrived yet, but the clerk motioned for us to lay out materials. Susan opened the binder. I arranged the evidence in 3 piles, documents dated and sourced from 2015 metadata for electronic verification. The Raven Holdings chain. We didn't need theatrics. We needed clarity. 10 minutes later, the judge entered. He reviewed the prior motion. Then turned to us. Counselor, he said, addressing Susan, you may present. She began calmly. Timeline, intent, pattern. Then she paused and turned to me. Ms. Hayes, would you like to speak? I stood. Hands steady. Voice clear. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because the truth has a paper trail. And they forgot to burn one piece too many. Ivy's attorney objected. Slanderous. This is a family matter. The judge raised his hand. Let's look at the evidence first. One by one, we walked him through it. Dad's email. The scanned will. Metadata. Submission log. Brian's name on company paperwork. He looked at Ivy. You were involved in the sale of this property under the assumption of sole ownership. Her lawyer nodded. The 2022 will was valid. And the prior? Outdated? He replied. The judge turned back to the file. I see no record of revocation, no filing to override the 2015 version, and clear evidence of intent. He paused. Then wrote something down. Susan whispered. Why may have just shifted everything. After the session, we stepped outside. The hallway smelled like waxed tile and coffee from a nearby vending machine. I saw Brian lean against the wall, face pale. Ivy pulled out her phone, fingers flying across the screen. Susan handed me the binder. We're not done, she said. But we're winning now. I went home and placed the file back in its lockbox. Poured myself a cup of tea. And sat down with one simple thought. They wanted me erased. But now the record speaks louder than their silence. The final hearing wasn't supposed to be dramatic, but when Ivy walked into that courtroom, I saw something crack beneath her perfect posture. Her steps slower. Her eyes darting. Not at me, but at the man beside her. Brian. He looked like a man walking into a storm he couldn't name. Susan handed over our exhibit packet. 43 pages, each numbered, tabbed, and time-stamped. She placed a second copy in front of Ivy's lawyer, and a third before the judge. The judge adjusted his glasses. Let's begin. Susan opened with the digital chain. Exhibit A Original Will, dated 2015, signed, digitally stored, metadata intact. Exhibit B Email from Mr. Henry Hayes, confirming intention to leave property to the petitioner, dated June 3, 2015. The judge flipped through the pages, slow and methodical. Exhibit C metadata from USB drive used to back up the file. Originally connected to Mr. Hayes's home desktop, matched to his registered IP address. Ivy's attorney interrupted. Your Honor, we have not verified those timestamps independently. Susan didn't flinch. Why have a digital forensic expert who will testify under oath that no edits have been made since 2016. The scan is clean. The judge looked at the opposing table. Do you contest the authenticity of this document? Ivy's lawyer paused. No, Your Honor. We contest its relevance. Then came the Raven Holdings file. Brian's name on incorporation records. Routing numbers, property transfers, shell entities. Susan laid the last page down, a signed contract between Ivy Hayes and Raven Holdings LLC, finalizing sale of the property at 43 Elkhart Avenue. The judge turned to Ivy. Ms. Hayes, did you disclose the existence of a prior will when filing the 2022 version? Ivy shifted in her seat. I thought it had been revoked. By whom? My father. Do you have proof? No.
Quiet.
Flat. Susan stood. Your Honor, we also have the closing inspection form scheduled 2 weeks prior to our emergency injunction. Ivy Hayes was preparing to finalize the sale of the home through a shell corporation her fiancé helped register. The petitioner was unaware of any intent to revoke the 2015 will. No filing to override the prior document exists. Ivy's attorney objected. This is circumstantial. The judge raised his hand. Enough. He turned to me. Ms. Hayes, please stand. I stood. Steady. Finally. Why do you believe this house belongs to you? I looked him in the eye. Because I earned it, I stayed. I gave up career offers, relationships, a life. I took care of my mother when no one else would. I paid half the mortgage when my father forgot. I fixed leaks, bought groceries, repaired broken steps with my own hands, and when I asked about the will, he told me, it's yours. Not in passing. Not as a joke, but in writing. And then he scanned it and sent it to me. Because he knew he might forget, and because he trusted I wouldn't. The courtroom was silent. The judge leaned forward. And you're not asking for damages? No, I said. I just want my name back where it was always meant to be. The judge sat back, then nodded. I will issue a ruling within 10 business days. All title freezes will remain in place until that date. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck wood. Just once. But the sound echoed in my chest. I didn't look at Ivy as I left. But I heard her voice behind me. This isn't over. I didn't turn, because it was. At least, for me. Outside, the air was crisp. Dogwood trees had started to bloom along the courthouse walkway. Susan walked beside me. No matter what happens next, we did what needed to be done. I nodded. Thanks for believing me before the papers did. That night, I sat with a cup of tea and read Dad's email one more time. You've earned this house more than anyone. I love you. And for the first time since the will reading, I let myself cry. Not because I was erased, but because I'd brought myself back. 2 days later, Susan called. The ruling came early. I answered on the second ring. You won, she said. Judge restored the 2015 will as primary intent. All sales are nullified. Title reverts to you. They can't appeal. He used the words willful concealment. I sank into the kitchen chair. The mug in my hand shook slightly. I keep the house? I asked. You keep everything. Later that week, a sign appeared outside the house. But it wasn't for sale. It read, PROPUINDERPURTIONOWNERHRLOTEUAS. Ivy never contacted me again. Brian disappeared from her social media. The house was mine. But more importantly, the story was mine again. I moved back into the house in early May. The air smelled like wet brick and lilacs. The kind of scent that clings to windowsills and memory. The dogwoods were still blooming. Petals curled gently across the walkway like they'd waited for me. And maybe, in some strange way, they had. The front door creaked in that familiar way. 2 beats, then the groan. No one had oiled it. I didn't want them to. That sound had always meant Home. It was quiet, but not empty, not cold. Just mine. I spent the first week scrubbing every room by hand. The kitchen tiles still held the faint scent of bleach and lemon from years ago. The cabinet hinge in the hallway still stuck slightly. I left it alone. I repainted the shutters. Soft gray, like they used to be before Ivy decided on black. Sanded the porch swing until it felt like new wood again. My fingers tracing over knots like old wounds. I didn't fix the uneven floorboard in the foyer. Some things I wanted to feel under my feet, to remind me where I'd stood, where I'd been stepped over. Mom passed away 6 weeks later. Peacefully. In her sleep, the nurse said her breathing just slowed and slowed. Then stopped. Like she'd finally exhaled something she'd been holding for years. I was there an hour later. They'd already folded her hands. Placed her favorite shawl around her shoulders, the one I'd knit for her 3 winters ago when she was cold and didn't remember how to say so. She looked small, but not frail. Just done. We buried her beside Dad. A short ceremony. Clouds hung low but didn't open. Susan stood beside me. So did Daniel and Kayla. No long speeches, no family drama. Just Billie Holiday playing softly from a Bluetooth speaker tucked inside my coat pocket. I'll be seeing you. Ivy didn't come. She sent flowers. White lilies in a ribboned arrangement. Or maybe her assistant did. I didn't check the card. After the funeral, when the last car pulled away, I stayed. I walked the path behind the house, barefoot. The grass was cool and wet, dotted with early clover. I passed the old tree Dad used to string lights through in December. The same tree I'd climbed as a girl, once falling and spraining my ankle while Ivy watched from the kitchen window. It stood taller now, but less intimidating. Everything did. Later that evening, I climbed into the attic. The dust was thicker than I remembered. It clung to my sleeves and made the air taste like paper and time. I found the cedar chest in the corner. Inside, recipe cards in Mom's handwriting, a box of old Polaroids, an envelope labeled Charlotte 1977. Inside, a crocheted baby blanket, pale green, faded, soft, and then a letter, folded neatly. My name on the front. Dad's handwriting. Sharp, upright, measured. I sat down cross-legged on the attic floor. Opened it carefully. It wasn't long. Just a page. He wrote that he regretted not saying more. That silence wasn't strength. It was fear. He said he'd let Ivy control the narrative because she was louder. Because it was easier. He admitted he'd wanted to speak up. To correct things. But thought he'd have more time. Thought I already knew. And maybe I had. Maybe I just needed him to say it. Out loud, he ended the letter with, "I never stopped believing you were the one who kept this family from falling apart. And I hope, someday, you'll feel that again. For yourself." I folded it back, pressed it to my chest, and stayed there a long time. That summer, I hosted a dinner, nothing extravagant, just a long wooden table on the porch, citronella candles, folded cloth napkins. Susan brought peach cobbler. Kayla made salad with real cranberries. Daniel, despite protest, showed up with perfectly grilled salmon and his best linen shirt. We laughed. We clinked glasses. We didn't perform. I looked around that table and realized no one needed me to be smaller to make space for them. No one interrupted. No one erased. I was seen. Fully, softly. I framed the original wall behind my desk. Not as revenge. As remembrance. Some things are worth protecting. Not because they're valuable, but because they were almost lost. And I refuse to lose myself again. The house no longer feels like a battleground. It breathes with me now. When I sweep the kitchen, I hum without realizing. When I fold laundry, I leave the radio on. And when I walk the hallway at night, I no longer brace myself for ghosts. Only memories. And they're softer now, easier to hold. They tried to erase me. From paper. From story. From home. But they forgot. I keep records. I remember what matters. And I know how to rebuild. I don't know if Ivy will ever understand what she did. I don't need her to. Forgiveness doesn't require access, only boundaries. And clarity. Sometimes I sit on the porch with my tea and watch the sun lower behind the tree line. I think of all the versions of myself that tried to stay silent to keep the peace. And how that silence almost cost me everything. Now, I speak. I hold my space. I write my name, bold, even when my voice shakes. They cut me from the will, but what they didn't know was, I'd already written myself back in. Not through revenge, but through truth, through care, through choosing to stay when it mattered, and choosing to leave when it didn't. If you've ever had to reclaim your place, your name, your voice, your truth, tell me. You're not alone. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it speaks in quiet, steady steps, and it still wins. Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more real stories of closure and empowerment.